Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing you how the concepts of evolution have been applied through every unit this year. So we went through 6 major topics in AP biology, starting with Unit 1, macromolecules. When we talked about the origins of those organic molecules is how we tied in evolution. In Unit 2, we talked about the endosymbiotic theory. In Unit 3, we used the evidence of glycolysis for the biochemical pathway that LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, must have done. In Unit 4, when we were talking about cell division and heredity, we started incorporating population genetics and the evolution of population genetics using Hardy-Weinberg. Then in Unit 5, we looked at how the universal genetic code is the same for all organisms on Earth. And then Unit 6 was our major evolution unit. So in Unit 1, macromolecules, we talked about organic life on Earth. The Miller-Urey experiment was the test for the primordial soup hypothesis, where we looked at how organic molecules could be formed from inorganic precursors with the input of free energy. And they modeled the conditions of primitive Earth to display that certain organic molecules could be formed. We also started with phylogeny back in Unit 1, where we used macromolecules such as proteins and nucleic acids to build phylogenetic trees. In Unit 2, cell biology, we talked about the similarities between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, such as they all have the same genetic information as DNA. They both use ribosomes. But we also talked about the endosymbiotic theory, which is the evolution of eukaryotes from prokaryotic cells due to a symbiotic relationship. And the two organelles that we focused on was the chloroplast and the mitochondria, and we looked at the evidence to support the endosymbiotic theory. We also talked about the oxygen catastrophe and how that increase of O2 due to photosynthetic organisms nearly killed off life on Earth, but then that led to the evolution of multicellular complex cells. In Unit 3 for energetics, we used pieces of evidence that glycolysis was the biochemical pathway for energy breakdown in LUCA. We talked about glycolysis being anaerobic, that it occurs in the cytoplasm, and the fact that all cells do it. There's also this concept that all organisms use the same energy molecule of ATP to power those exergonic reactions. Now, it's very unlikely that these organisms all came up with this ATP molecule as the energy currency on their own. It must have come from a common ancestor that then passed it on to the next generation. In Unit 4, we talked about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and that's how we would mathematically show that a population is changing. So we talked about the conditions of Hardy-Weinberg and the fact that you compare those before and after for those allele frequencies to see if those values changed. Now, keep in mind that when we talked about evolution, we were talking about genetics. We talked about genotype and phenotype, and it's the phenotype that's going to be selected against or for in a population that's evolving. So the phenotype is the physical characteristics, and because there's variation in organisms, so for example, blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, hazel eyes, those different phenotypes are going to have pressures on them that are going to result in differences between those organisms and the populations. And more importantly, it's going to result in differences between the reproductive success of organisms in those populations. Unit 5 was molecular biology, and we can use DNA homologies as evidence of common ancestors. So what genetic information do we all share? But even above that, even at a higher level, the fact that we all use DNA as the genetic code must have been because that genetic code was passed on from an ancient ancestor to the next generation. And so we can use this genetic information, this common DNA between all organisms, as evidence that it must have come from a common ancestor. It is worth noting also that molecular homologies, which is DNA similarities, are more accurate than morphological comparisons. So if we try to group organisms together by the fact that they have wings, that's not going to be as accurate as if we were compared to looking at the genetic information of the organism and then grouping them together that way. So Unit 6 was the big one for evolution, and evolution is a process, and there are some assumptions that are made in these processes. Number one, that individuals within species are variable. So that even within the same species, you're going to have slight differences between them in their physical characteristics. Number two, that those characteristics are passed on to the next generation. Very, very important in evolution is that these traits that we're looking at, we have to look at, are they able to be passed on to the next generation? Number three, in every generation, there's going to be more offspring that are produced than can survive, and this is due to the carrying capacity of the environment. And then number four, the survival and reproduction of individuals are not random. The individuals who survive and go on to reproduce the most are those with the most favorable variation, and they are naturally selected. Now, we did see an example of where it is due to random circumstances. But natural selection is looking at looking at this, whether or not it is favorable, whether or not a trait is going to be passed on to the next generation. And so when we talked about natural selection, we talked about it being stabilizing, disruptive, or directional. But if it's not based on the phenotype, if it's based instead on random chance, then that is the process known as genetic drift. So genetic drift can be random events that come up through the formation of those gametes, such as independent assortment, the bottleneck effect, the founder effect. And so natural selection and genetic drift are kind of opposite to each other in that genetic drift is random and natural selection isn't random. We also looked at some evidence of evolution, including embryology, morphology, genetic evidence, biogeographical evidence, and then we also talked about speciation. Now, how do different species arise? They arise through a process that is called reproductive isolation. And when we talked about reproductive isolation, we talked about both prezygotic and postzygotic isolation mechanisms, and being able to identify what these are based on examples or based on background information is a very important skill to have for this. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful.